Welcome back to the deep dive. Today we are not just reading a book. We are entering a crime scene.
That is a very apt way to put it, honestly.
Yeah, we are pulling back the curtain on the Industrial Revolution. And I don't mean the textbook version you learned in school.
Right, not the triumphant steam engines.
Exactly. Not the great exhibition of 1851 with all the shiny brass. The stuff that was hidden in the footnotes. We are talking about the hidden factory.
The invisible one. The one that leaked out of the industrial districts and just seeped into the living rooms, the cottages, and the backyards of England.
So we are diving deep into Karl Marx's Capital, Volume 1. Specifically, we're looking at Chapter 15, Parts 8, 9, and 10.
Which is the section on machinery and large-scale industry.
Right. And I have to say, reading through the source material for this deep dive, it was heavy. It was really heavy.
It's arguably the most brutal section of the entire book.
Because it's not just theory, is it? I mean, we're not talking about abstract value and commodities here. Marx is acting like a prosecutor. He's piling up evidence.
Exactly. And we should clarify for you, the listener, right up front regarding the sources here. Marx is relying heavily on what were called the blue books.
The parliamentary reports?
Right, the official British government reports, the Children's Employment Commissions, the public health reports. These weren't, socialist propaganda pamphlets.
No.
These were the British government's own inspectors documenting in just excruciating detail what was happening to the bodies of their citizens.
And as always, we want to make it clear that we aren't here to take any political sides or endorse Marx's broader ideology. Our mission today is just to unpack the original source material impartially. We are simply conveying the ideas and the historical data contained in the text.
Absolutely. We're looking at the historical record he compiled.
And what struck me was the sheer volume of that data. Marx is building a case that the revolutionary impact of large-scale industry wasn't just an economic shift, it was a biological event.
A biological and geological event.
Yes.
It changed the human body. And as we'll see by the end of this deep dive, it actually changed the soil of the earth itself. It is a roadmap of destruction.
So let's map this out for you guys. We're going to start with the destruction of the old handicrafts, the machine versus the hand.
Right.
Then we're going to look at this concept of modern domestic industry, which sounds, well, it sounds cozy, but let me tell you, it is the stuff of nightmares.
Oh, absolutely. Then we have to take a tour of the specific industries. Marx calls them slaughterhouses.
Yeah, that word choice.
It's visceral. We'll look at brickmaking, lace, and the straw plaiting trade.
And then we can't skip the legal battle, the Factory Acts, because eventually society had to step in. But I was really surprised to find that Marx doesn't just pat the government on the back for passing laws.
No, not at all. He exposes the deep hypocrisy of the impossible arguments used by capitalists. And the irony that these regulations actually helped the big monopolies crush the little guys.
Right. And finally, we'll get into the metabolic rift, the environmental cost.
Which is where Marx sounds like he's writing in the modern day, not 1867.
Okay, let's get into it. I want to start with the needle.
The parable of the needle.
Yes, Marx uses this comparison between the old way and the new way, and he references Adam Smith here.
Right. So Adam Smith, writing in The Wealth of Nations decades earlier, was absolutely dazzled by the division of labor.
Mm-hmm.
He describes a pin or needle manufactory where 10 men work together.
One draws the wire, one straightens it.
One cuts it, one points it.
Yep,
Exactly.
and that coordination was revolutionary at the time.
It was. Smith calculated that these 10 men could produce about 48,000 needles in a day.
Okay.
That is 4,800 needles per person.
Which is a lot of needles.
It is a massive amount for hand labor. But then, Marx fast-forwards us to the machine age. He looks at his single needle-making machine. In an 11-hour workday, that one machine produces 145,000 needles.
Wow.
But wait, it gets crazier. One woman or girl can supervise 4 of those machines simultaneously.
So, okay, let me do the math. 4 machines times 145,000. That's nearly 600,000 needles a day.
Correct.
Produced by one person.
From 48,000 produced by 10 skilled men to nearly 600,000 produced by one unskilled woman just watching a machine.
That is a staggering jump in productivity. I mean, from a pure business perspective, that's a miracle. But what happens to the 10 men?
They are annihilated. That is the fundamental point Marx is driving at here. The machine doesn't just increase output, it destroys the social value of the artisan.
Right.
The handicraft, the specific skill that took years to learn, is rendered totally worthless instantly. The machine creates what Marx calls a surplus population, people who were just no longer needed by the economy.
But it's not always a clean break, is it? Because I was really fascinated by this transition period Marx describes. The cottage factory.
Ah,
It
yes.
sounds like something out of a steampunk novel.
The Coventry ribbon industry is the perfect example of this. This is a classic case of capital trying to have it both ways during a transitional era.
Paint the picture for us. What did this look like?
Okay, so imagine a square of traditional weavers' cottages. In the middle of the courtyard, the capitalists build an engine house with a massive steam engine.
Okay.
Then they run shafts, literally rotating physical shafts from that central engine through the walls and into the surrounding cottages.
So the weavers are still working in their own homes, but they are plugging their looms into this central steam power.
Exactly. It was kind of an early version of utility-scale steam. The weavers paid a weekly rent for the power to turn their looms.
I mean, that actually sounds kind of convenient. You get the raw power of the factory, but you get to stay in your own home. You don't have to commute to the dark satanic mill. So why didn't that work?
Well, think about the economics of it from the worker's side. You are paying rent for that power whether you use it or not.
Oh,
If you get sick, you pay. If the market dips and you have no ribbons to weave that week, you still pay the rent for the steam shaft.
so it's a subscription model you can't cancel.
Basically, yes. Plus, think about the physical reality. You have a massive vibrating steam shaft running right through your living room wall. It was loud, it was chaotic, it was dangerous.
Right.
But the real reason it failed was the logic of concentration. It is simply more efficient for the capitalist to have all the looms in one big building under one roof.
Because then they can supervise everyone.
Exactly. They can watch the workers, control the speed of the engine, and minimize the wasted energy of piping power into 300 different disjointed houses.
So the big building eventually won.
It crushed them. The struggle lasted about 12 years in Coventry, but eventually all those cottage factories went bankrupt. The big centralized factory just swallowed them up.
And we see the same thing with the steel pen industry, right?
Yes, the price drop there is unbelievable.
Yeah, I have the numbers here. In 1820, pens were 7 pounds and 4 shillings per gross. And by the time the country system took over, they were between 2 and 6 pence.
It's an absolute collapse in price. And it shows that handicrafts can survive for a little while as a transition, but eventually the centralized factory always swallows them.
It seems like that's the inevitable pattern. The centralized system eats the decentralized one.
In that era, yes. But here is where it gets really dark. We tend to assume that when the handicraft dies, everyone just moves into the big factory, right?
Right, they pack up and move to Manchester or whatever.
But Marx shows us a third option, a much worse option.
Modern domestic industry.
Yes.
Now, when I hear domestic industry, I think of like Etsy. I think of someone knitting scarves on their couch, setting their own hours, being their own boss.
That is the romantic myth. Marx calls it something very different. He calls it an external department of the factory.
So how does this actually work? Because if I'm working at home, how am I part of the factory?
Imagine the factory is just the headquarters. It does the heavy lifting, maybe the initial cutting of the cloth, but then it relies on these invisible threads reaching out into the countryside, into the slums, into the farmhouses.
To do the detail work.
Right. The factory gives the finishing work, the stitching, the buttonholing, the lace work, to an absolute army of outworkers.
He gives a really specific example from Londonderry, a shirt factory.
Yes, Mrs. Tilley.
Huh?
This was a massive operation. They had a physical factory building with about 1,000 people working inside it, but they employed 9,000 outworkers spread across the countryside.
So for every one person inside the walls, there are 9 people invisible to the public working for the exact same company.
Precisely. And I want to ask you, why would a capitalist do that? Why not just build a bigger factory and put all 10,000 people inside?
Well, I assume it's cheaper.
Why is it cheaper?
I guess you don't have to pay for the building.
Bingo. If I employ you in my factory, I have to build the roof over your head. I have to pay for the coal to heat the room. I have to pay for the gas lights so you can see your work. If I send the work to your cottage, who pays for the rent?
I do.
Who pays for the candle you have to burn at midnight because the quota is so insanely high?
I do? Wow.
That is the evil genius of modern domestic industry. It shifts the overhead costs of production entirely onto the worker. And it exploits the fact that you are desperate and isolated.
Because in the factory, you might talk to the person next to you. You might organize. You might form a union.
Exactly. Scattered in your own individual kitchens, you are powerless.
And he mentions the parasites in this system, the middlemen.
Right. The factory often didn't even deal with the outworkers directly. They hired subcontractors. The The subcontractor takes a cut of the pay. Then maybe he hires a subcontractor who takes another cut.
So by the time the wage trickles down to the actual woman sewing the shirt,
It has been shaved down to almost nothing. It's starvation wages.
it creates this reserve army of labor that capital can just tap into whenever it wants.
And discard just as easily. If market demand drops, you don't have to fire anyone or deal with severance. You just stop sending the bundles of cloth to their houses. You essentially ghost them.
This brings us to the human cost. And I want to warn you, the listener, this is the part of the transcript where it gets really visceral. Marx calls these places slaughterhouses. And he's not being poetic.
No. He's looking at the mortality rates. He's looking at the bodies.
Let's talk about the rag sorters first. This felt like a scene from a horror movie to me.
It's the absolute bottom of the supply chain. Great Britain was essentially the emporium for the world's rags at this time. They were imported from everywhere: Japan, South America, Egypt.
And what were they used for?
Papermaking mostly.
Yeah.
And shoddy, which is recycled wool. But these rags would arrive filthy, often from areas with active plagues or smallpox outbreaks. And who sorted them?
Women and young girls.
Women and young girls. Marx notes they literally became the carriers for smallpox.
They were the first line of infection.
Yes, they were sorting through the cast-off clothes of the dead to feed the paper mills of London. It really shows the global connectivity of disease and commerce even back then.
But if we want to talk about sheer physical destruction, we have to talk about brick making.
This section, it just stays with you. Brick making was mostly an outdoor industry. Temporary brick fields on the edge of growing cities. The machinery was primitive, so they used human machines instead.
The timestamps in the blue books are what really hit me here. Marx details the working hours.
5 a.m. to 9 p.m. That was a standard day in the summer.
16 hours.
And often the children were woken up at 4 a.m. to get ready. And we are talking about children as young as 4, 5, and 6 years old.
There is one specific anecdote Marx pulls from the report. A young woman, 24 years old, at a place called Moxley.
Yes, she was a brickmaker. She made 2,000 bricks a day.
2,000.
But she couldn't do it alone. She had 2 little girls helping her, quote, carry the clay.
I tried to visualize this carrying the clay. It doesn't sound too hard until you look at the physics Marx lays out.
It's the weight and the terrain. These little girls were carrying 10 tons of clay a day.
10 ton.
But not on flat ground. They had to carry it up the slippery sides of the clay pits from a depth of 30 feet. And then walk a distance of 210 feet to the molding table.
10 tons. Up a 30-foot, slippery, muddy pit. For a child, I mean, it sounds physically impossible.
And yet, it was the daily standard. And the result was that these children were just broken. Physically, they were stunted, their spines were deformed. But Marx also highlights the moral panic in the government reports.
Right, the commissioners seemed almost more obsessed with the fact that these kids were wild than the fact that they were dying.
That's the Victorian lens for you. The inspectors were horrified that men and women, boys and girls, were sleeping in these tiny, filthy huts together in the brick fields. They called them degenerate.
There's that one quote from the inspector, "You might as well try to raise and improve the devil as a bricky, sir."
Exactly. Society looked at them as monsters. Marx looks at them and sees victims of a system that has stripped them of everything: education, hygiene, decency, all just to get cheap bricks to build the city.
And then you have the complete opposite extreme in terms of the product. Lace making. You think of lace, you think of something delicate, refined, clean.
But Marx argues it was actually deadlier than the brick fields.
Why? How is lace more dangerous than 10 tons of clay?
The lace schools. Again, a total misnomer. They weren't schools. These were tiny workshops, often just a spare room in a cottage. To keep the lace pristine and to keep the workers' hands sensitive to the fine threads, they kept the rooms completely sealed.
No ventilation.
None. They literally blocked the chimneys to stop soot. They sealed the windows to stop drafts. And you'd have 20 or 30 children packed into one small room.
Marx does the math on the air quality here, and this was fascinating data.
He compares the cubic feet of air allowed per person. In a standard military barrack, a soldier was required by law to have 500 to 600 cubic feet of air.
Okay.
In a military hospital, it was 1,200 cubic feet.
And in the Lee School?
67 to 100 cubic feet.
So they are essentially suffocating.
Slowly. They're breathing in the gas fumes from the lighting, the dust from the fabric, and each other's exhalations. The oxygen is just completely depleted, and the result is consumption. Tuberculosis.
The stats on TB in the report are terrifying.
Dr. Truman, a physician Marx quotes directly, showed that the rate of consumption among lace makers skyrocketed. In 1852, It was 1 in 45 dying of TB.
Which is already bad.
But by 1861, less than a decade later, it was 1 in 8.
1 in 8, that is a decimation.
And remember, these are mostly girls and young women, creating luxury items for the wealthy while coughing their lungs out in sealed rooms.
And the youngest victims of all this, the straw plating industry.
Straw plate schools, where they employed children as young as 3 years old.
3. My nephew's 3. He can barely hold a spoon.
Imagine him being forced to plait stiff straw for hours on end. Marx notes a really gruesome detail from the inspector's report. The children had to keep the straw moist to work it without it breaking, but they didn't have bowls of water, so they used their own saliva. They were constantly wetting the sharp straw with their mouths.
And the straw cuts them.
It cut their mouths constantly, cut their fingers. The report explicitly talks about their hacked fingers bleeding onto the straw. And here is the real tragedy of it. The parents were the ones making them do it.
That's a hard pill to swallow. It's really easy to just judge the parents and say they were abusive.
But Marx stops us from doing that. He argues the parents had become slave drivers, not because they were inherently cruel, but because the economic system gave them literally no choice.
Right, they were starving.
The adult wages had been driven so low by machinery that the whole family would starve if the 3-year-old didn't earn a few pennies a day. The machine had devalued the man's labor so much that he had to sell his children to survive.
Speaking of machines devaluing labor, we have to talk about the sewing machine, because this is a classic example of how a new technology completely backfires on the worker.
The sewing machine is usually presented historically as a great liberator of women's labor. And in the very long run, it was highly efficient. But in the transition period, it was a weapon.
How so? Walk us through that transition.
When the machine first arrived, it attacked the old wearing apparel industry. It destroyed the monopoly of the skilled male tailor. Suddenly, you didn't need to know how to sew a perfect seam by hand over several years of apprenticeship. You just needed to act as a minder for the machine.
So it replaced skilled men with unskilled girls.
Yes, but it also put incredible lethal pressure on the women who couldn't afford to buy a machine, the old hand sewers.
Because the machine could sew so much faster, the price of making a shirt just dropped through the floor.
Exactly. So if you are still trying to sew by hand in your garret, you suddenly have to work 15, maybe 18 hours a day just to buy a loaf of bread. Marx explicitly connects the arrival of the sewing machine to a fearful increase in death from starvation among seamstresses in London.
And then the machine itself evolves, right? Because at first they were just hand-cranked.
Which was exhausting. Then they became foot-treadled.
But then, steam.
And this is the clincher. Once you attach a steam engine to a sewing machine, you can't work in a garret anymore. You need a factory. The cost of the machinery rises. The small masters who bought a few treadle machines go bankrupt. And the entire industry concentrates into the hands of the giant capitalists.
So the sewing machine started by exploiting the home worker, drove the hand sewers to starvation, and ended by forcing everyone into the centralized factory anyway.
That is the cycle of capital. It always returns to concentration.
Which brings us to the Factory Acts, the legislation. Now, I always assumed, and I think most people assume, that regulations were just good. The government sees people dying, they pass a law, things get better.
It's much, much more complicated than that. Marx argues that capital, left to its own devices, is essentially suicidal. It will consume the workforce until there is literally no one left to work. So the state had to step in, not out of humanitarian kindness, but to prevent the total destruction of the population. They needed soldiers and workers for the next generation.
But the capitalists still fought it.
Tooth and nail. And their arguments were fascinating to read. They constantly cried, "The impossible."
Give us an example of that.
The pottery industry is a great one.
Okay.
The 1864 Act proposed limiting the hours of children and requiring basic ventilation in the potteries. The pottery owners screamed. They went to Parliament and said, "Our technology requires the pottery to dry in hot stoves for a specific amount of hours. If you cut the hours, the pottery won't dry. The industry will collapse. It is physically impossible to regulate us."
But the act passed anyway.
It passed, and lo and behold, within 16 months, the impossible vanished. The owners, forced by the law, invented a completely new method, drying by pressure instead of heat and evaporation.
So the regulation actually forced them to innovate.
It made the process faster, cheaper, and cleaner. Marx absolutely loves this irony. Capital declares every single restriction a natural barrier, until the law forces them to jump over it. Then suddenly they claim credit for the innovation.
But my favorite part of this whole section, if you can call it a favorite part, is the mining inquiry.
Oh, the blue books on the mines are incredible.
The dialogue here is just wild. Marx transcribes the cross-examination between the mine owners, who are acting as the parliamentary committee asking the questions, and the miners, who are the witnesses. It reads like a courtroom drama where the judge is also the defendant.
It highlights the absolute class arrogance of the era perfectly.
I really want to read a bit of this back and forth just to give you the flavor of what's in the text.
Yeah.
The issue they are debating is safety inspections. The miners wanted government inspectors to actually go underground.
Right, because the current inspectors were either too lazy or too scared to go down the shafts. They just checked the accounting books in the pristine office up top.
So imagine I'm the mine owner on the committee, and you're the miner.
Okay, go ahead.
Tell me, my good man, do you think it is possible for government to call a set of men into existence who can inspect the mines without, how shall I put this, without creeping into the holes and corners?
No, I don't think they can.
But surely, would it not be better if the inspector were to interview a manager and 2 or 3 skillful workmen instead of going down there himself?
No. The government inspector should go down. He should visit the places himself.
But do you not think that a miner, such as yourself, might be biased? Do you desire a lower class of inspector?
I don't know about class. I want an inspector who knows what a mine is. A man who has been in one.
But wouldn't that take the responsibility away from the owners if the government looks at it?
No. The government should see the danger.
It's infuriating. You can just hear the owner trying to twist the miner's words, trying to say, oh, you just want uneducated inspectors, or you want to absolve us of our moral responsibility.
And the miner just refuses to play the game. He sticks purely to the material reality. If you don't go down the hole, you don't know the danger. Period.
And then there's the widow argument in that same inquiry.
Oh, yes. Think of the poor widow's defense.
The miners wanted to ban women from working on the pit banks, which was this brutal, dirty work, hauling coal on the surface in the freezing rain.
And the owners argued, we only employ these women out of charity. Many of them are widows. If we stop employing them, they will starve.
And the miner's retort is classic. He says, essentially, I would respect the fair sex more by keeping them off the pit bank.
He sees right through it. He knows the owners employ women because they can pay them half the wage of a man, not because they care about widows.
But here is the major twist ending of the Factory X section. We tend to think regulation hurts big business, helps workers, Marx says. Not quite.
This is the dialectic at work. The Factory Acts impose strict rules. Whitewashing walls, proper ventilation, safety guards on gears, mandatory school hours for the child workers. These things cost real money.
Right.
Who has money? The giant factory owner. Who doesn't have money? The small workshop master. The cottage industry guy.
So by enforcing these expensive safety standards,
You wipe out the competition. The Factory Acts systematically destroyed the small, inefficient workshops that couldn't afford to comply. This funneled all the business and all the desperate workers directly into the hands of the large industrial capitalists.
So the law actually accelerated the concentration of capital. It artificially ripened the Industrial Revolution.
Exactly. It killed the hidden factory and forced everyone into the visible giant factory. It cleared the board for the monopolies.
Which perfectly sets up the final and perhaps most massive monopoly of all, the land itself. Section 6, agriculture.
Part 10 of the chapter. We usually think of the Industrial Revolution as strictly a city thing. Smokestacks, Manchester, London, smog, Marx says. Look at the fields.
The machine conquers the farm just like it conquered the loom.
And with the exact same result, the destruction of the peasant. The old way of life where a family worked the land and had a generational connection to it is completely replaced by the wage laborer. The farm just becomes a factory without a roof.
And the population dynamics completely flip.
The rural population decreases, both absolutely and relatively, while the cultivated area actually increases. The surplus people are kicked off the land, set free, as Marx sarcastically puts it, and forced into the cities to become the cheap labor for the factories we just talked about.
But then he introduces this concept of the metabolic rift. And honestly, this felt like the most modern, prophetic part of the entire text.
It is profound. Marx is relying on the work of the German agricultural chemist Justus von Liebig here. He argues that capitalist agriculture fundamentally disturbs the metabolic interaction between humanity and the earth.
Let's break that down for the listener. What exactly is the metabolic interaction?
Think of it as a circle, a natural, sustainable loop. We consume food, grains, vegetables, fruits that grow from the soil. Those plants took vital nutrients out of the soil to grow. In a natural local-out cycle, our waste and the waste of the farm animals would go right back into that same soil to replenish those nutrients.
Ashes to ashes, dust to dust, the nutrients return.
Precisely. But capitalism breaks the loop. It creates a rift.
How?
By separating the population into town and country.
Yeah.
It takes the grain from the countryside and ships it hundreds of miles away to the overcrowded city. The people in London consume the nutrients. But does the waste go back to the fields in Yorkshire?
No. In the 19th century, it went straight into the Thames.
It becomes pollution. It literally poisons the city. Meanwhile, back in the countryside, the soil is steadily depleted. It has been robbed of its nitrogen and phosphorus.
So you have toxic pollution in one place and sterility in the other.
And this forces the farmer to desperate global measures. Marx talks about the need to import guano bird droppings all the way from South America or scavenge bones from old European battlefields just to try artificially fertilize the soil because the natural cycle is permanently broken.
He calls it robbery.
He does. The quote is incredible. All progress in capitalist agriculture is a progress in the art, not only of robbing the laborer, but of robbing the soil.
That is a hell of a quote.
It totally connects the exploitation of nature with the exploitation of the human body. Marx says the system saps the original sources of all wealth, the soil and the laborer. It treats both as infinite resources to be burned up.
He even mentions the United States in this section, doesn't he?
He does. He notes that this destruction is even faster in the U.S. He calls it the stride of 7-league boots. Because in America, they had so much pristine land, they could just ruin one area, exhaust the soil completely, and move west to start over. But the underlying logic is exactly the same. Total exhaustion.
So we really have this parallel ruin happening. The ruin of the intellectual and social life of the rural worker, who is left isolated and dispersed, and the ruin of the physical health of the urban worker.
Correct. The machine concentrates the urban workers and breaks their bodies in the factory. It disperses the rural workers and breaks their connection to the land. It's a totalizing system.
We have covered so much ground here today, from the needle to the brick field, from the lace school to the coal mine, and finally down to the exhausted soil itself. It is a bleak picture.
It is, but it's a meticulously documented picture of a system that is, in Marx's view, running on a fatal contradiction.
So what is the takeaway for us today? Why does reading this 1867 text matter in the 21st century?
Because the hidden factory hasn't gone away. It hasn't disappeared. It's just shape-shifted.
I couldn't help but think about the modern domestic industry part while we were prepping, the whole idea of the outworker.
It's the gig economy.
Right. Think about a food delivery driver today. They use their own car. That's the rent and overhead Marx talked about. They pay for their own gas, they pay for their own insurance, they cover the maintenance.
The app, which is the capital in this scenario, simply connects the customer to the worker and takes a cut. The invisible threads are digital now. But the fundamental economic relationship is identical to the Londonderry shirt factory. The infrastructure cost is shifted from the company to the isolated worker.
And they are kept apart, so they can't organize easily.
Exactly. And what about the metabolic rift? I mean, look at the environmental news today.
We have broken the cycle on a planetary scale now. We are extracting nutrients and fossil fuels, burning them, and dumping the waste into the atmosphere and the oceans. The loop is definitely not closed.
Marx saw, over 150 years ago, that a system based on infinite accumulation simply cannot respect natural limits.
And the arguments against fixing it, it will kill the economy. It's impossible.
The exact same song. Whether it's the pottery owners in 1864 or the fossil fuel companies today, regulation is impossible. But history shows us that's usually just a lie to protect short-term profit.
It really makes you look at the objects around you differently. The smartphone in your pocket, the clothes you're wearing right now.
There is a hidden factory behind all of it, and there is always a cost. Marx forces us to ask, who is paying that cost? Is it the soil? Is it a child in a brick field historically, or today, maybe a miner pulling cobalt out of the earth?
Here is a final thought to leave you with. We tend to think of industrial progress as a straight line pointing up. Better machines, better lives, more leisure. But Marx paints it as a giant machine that requires fuel to run. And that fuel is two things: the exhaustion of the worker's body and the exhaustion of the Earth's soil.
If the machine consumes its own fuel source, if it burns up the very things it needs to exist, how long can it keep running?
That is the ultimate question. Thanks for taking this deep dive with us today. Look for the invisible threads in your own life this week. We'll see you next time.